Alright, YouTube, Obama may have just made the most quickly broken promise in all of U.S. political history. A few days ago, of course, Obama said, I'm considering airstrikes in Iraq to target these, ISIS forces. But he said there will be no boots on the ground. No ifs, ands, or buts, it's final, I'm not even considering it. And now there are boots on the ground in Iraq. Yes, 275 soldiers have been sent, and there's a status here from literally just a few minutes ago from PZ Feed, who usually gets the news faster than anyone else. I'll link their Facebook page in the description. Breaking news, approximately 275 U.S. troops deployed to Iraq equipped for combat, ordered by President Obama. Now, when people said yes, they should go and evacuate this embassy and get our people out of there, I don't think what they meant is we should drop a bunch more people in there and keep them there. I think what they actually meant was if you do drop troops on the base, they should be there long enough to make sure everybody else is out, and then they too should leave. He's breaking his own promise from just a few days ago when he clearly said that there would be no boots on the ground. These are apparently armed, actual soldiers, actually armed for combat roles. These are not simply specialists that are, we're loaning them to the Iraqis to do intelligence or something. It befuddles me. I'm almost left speechless as to how he can make that promise with a straight face, and then a few days later, when it's still fresh in everybody's mind, he decides to do this. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I'm trying to understand in what scenario Obama finds it logical to first say that there will be no soldiers put in Iraq and then put soldiers in Iraq a few days later. I'm trying to wrap my mind around what possible scenario that could, number one, be a good idea, and number two, escape people's notice as to the fact that he had already promised not to. I'm trying to understand this, and I'm just drawing a blank, I guess. I guess I just don't understand his high-minded logic. I'm sure that nothing could possibly go wrong with putting a very small contingency of U.S. forces on the ground in Iraq. I'm assuming they're not just simply going to stay on this base and do nothing the entire time. They're probably going to actually be in combat against ISIS forces, or at least assisting Iraqis in doing so. I'm trying to think of a situation in which there won't be any casualties, and again, I'm drawing a blank. And as soon as the first U.S. soldier dies over there, of course Obama has his excuse to drop more men, to fire more missiles, to send in more drones and kill more probably innocent people bystanding as they fight with ISIS, and gives another excuse for why we need to keep our troops there longer. And of course Maliki can be killed off and a temporary government installed that will let us march right back in there, exactly what Obama supposedly did not want to do. Now, I already explained how the same people waging jihad currently in Iraq are actually Syrian fighters who simply came across the unguarded border and started wrecking shit. I already explained how they were being armed by the Saudis, supposedly an ally of ours and our bitch in the Middle East. I already explained how the money that we're giving to the Free Syrian Army and so forth is being filtered to ISIS. Because if ISIS is a group, let's think about this logically. Let's assume that this isn't a conspiracy at all and it's just oversight. It's just a lack of oversight on behalf of the U.S. government. If ISIS is capable of scaring Al-Qaeda, like the media supposedly says that it does, the media says, well, Al-Qaeda's even scared of them, so they're insane. Okay, if that's true, and ISIS is in Syria, which they clearly are, that's where they're sort of their spawning point. Wouldn't, if we're giving money to the FSA, wouldn't the FSA, which is supposedly a moderate group and much less violent than even Al-Qaeda, be absolutely terrified out of their minds at thousands of ISIS members that are already there? Wouldn't they then bribe them, pay them off somehow with this money and these armaments that we're giving them? Of course they would. And that's even going, you don't even have to get into the Saudi connection or the Israeli connection, or the CIA connection with running guns essentially to the Israelis and Saudis, having them take a cut and then turn around and give them to militants so we can keep these countries unstable. You don't even have to get into that. It's still a lack of oversight on behalf of the government to not know that these so-called moderate groups, which are cutting people's hearts out of their chests, beheading people, crucifying people, and so forth, would be terrified of ISIS and give them what they want so that they too are not beheaded. Because ISIS doesn't want competition. ISIS doesn't care about the Free Syrian Army. The Free Syrian Army wants to topple Assad and bring Sunni rule to Syria. ISIS wants to topple Assad and Maliki and bring extreme Sunni rule to the entire northern Iraq, northern Syria region, because it's part of this state that they want to create, this Levant sort of state that they keep talking about that they're never actually going to achieve without the tacit support of the Western world. Because we're the ones, our government anyway, has been funding these people. We've been pumping billions of dollars into this region and then saying, well, I wonder where the money went. Why hasn't the Free Syrian Army gotten rid of Assad yet? We've armed them so well. We've given them so much money. We've given them logistic support. Where did all your weapons go? ISIS was taking them the whole time, stockpiling them and getting ready for their holy war. I don't think that we need to be involved in this situation. Because supposedly, if you listen to Obama himself, supposedly, according to what he said in 2010, Iraq was a stable democracy. Terrorists would never be able to undermine it. Their troops had been trained properly. They were ready to stand on their own, and we were leaving. Now we find out none of that's true, or it is true, and this is all being manufactured for us to go back in, because, as I said, I believe Obama wants boots on the ground, but he wants them in Syria, and the only way he realizes he can do that, since the public reacted so violently to him saying that they would even use drones in Syria against Assad, I believe the only way he can see to get into Syria before he leaves the White House and get us involved in another pointless, unending war where we install Sharia law and get rid of a secular dictator who's at least generally liked, is to instead focus on Iraq getting fucked up and then say, well, there's terrorists running around. We spent so much time and money, now we have to go back in and protect our investment. And that's what he wants. Have you noticed that the areas that ISIS is now controlling roughly correspond to where the oil pipelines are in the region? There was somebody who pointed out a year ago that one of the major reasons for these conflicts that are currently happening is simply oil pipelines. Israel and the Saudis do not want to be bypassed. The danger is that Iraq, Syria, and Iran will team up, and there will be Iranian oil flowing into Europe and Iraqi oil flowing into the South Indian area, into India, into Pakistan, into all of these other countries, the Vietnam, Indonesia, that want to gobble up more and more oil to fund their industry. And they can do it a lot more cheaply rather than buying Saudi oil, which is getting somehow shipped to the Mediterranean and then back down the Suez, which makes no sense. All the pipelines go through Israel. Israel gets a cut of that profit. They get a little bit of money off of the oil transfers because they host the pipes, they maintain them and so forth. And the Saudis are the ones largely supplying the oil that's going through there, and the Iraqis now too. So if the Iraqis look like they're going to strike a deal with Iran and Syria, and Iran was already on board with this, to try to pipe this oil around Israel to Europe, and to try to pipe it around Saudi Arabia to the Asian continent, to South Asia, of course we're going to destabilize the region. Because otherwise Israel and Saudi Arabia might say, well, maybe you're not a good friend of our countries anymore after all, and we will have to start destabilizing things ourselves. At least, I guess the United States government says, well, at least if we're the ones causing things to be unstable, we can sort of keep a lid on it and get a little bit of what we want out of the situation. In fact, that's what you get. You get discounted oil from the Saudis as a special treat. And you get to use bases in Israel. Ooh, what a thrill. Well, we've already got bases in Iraq too, so when it looks like Iraq might swing to the other side, of course, somehow magically ISIS materializes out of thin air and starts waging jihad. It's too fishy. It's as fishy as Lois Lerner's emails being deleted. It's as fishy as the fact that Bergdahl was traded for 5 higher-ups in the Taliban. It's as fishy as the fact that yesterday 12 more militants were released from a prison in Afghanistan, and it was all hushed up by the media, and very few people apparently have heard the story. Tomorrow it might hit mainstream media, but you heard it first here most likely. things in the region are destabilizing, but we don't need to be the ones involved. Because the people that are funding these groups are not our allies. They are our fair-weathered friends, Israel and Saudi Arabia, which is exactly what they are, that we funnel massive amounts of money to, that we buy a massive amount of oil from, and which give us some statistical support in that region when we need to wage some sort of war. But the thing is, these same wars that we've been waging were all manufactured. Saddam hadn't done anything to anybody in the present tense. Yes, he had gassed Kurds in the past. He hadn't gassed anybody lately. The only other group he gassed was the Iranians when we asked him to, and gave him our support there, and then all of a sudden he became an enemy and we had to remove him. Part of that, I think, was just Bush wanted to make up for the fact that Daddy Bush didn't get Saddam at the time and held back. It's ridiculous. And to go back into this country is a horrible, horrible idea. Because we were all told under Bush, oh, it'll be fine, it'll be over in a year, it'll be over in 2 years, mission accomplished, everything's kosher. Shock and awe worked, they're underground, we win, ha ha ha. The whole future outlook for the entire country is just peachy now. Did it actually do anything? Is Iraq now, under 2 successive administrations and 3 successive full terms, is it any better off than it was under Saddam? Or is it worse? Is it any better off than when we had crippled all of their infrastructure just after shock and awe? I would argue that it's worse, that it is less stable now than it has ever been at any point in the past in human history, or at least since the fall of the Babylonians to their pagan neighbors. I would argue that this region hasn't been this filled with insanity and violence in thousands and thousands of years. And yet people say that although the United States played a leading role in destabilizing this country and allowing Al-Qaeda to move in, there are still people that somehow think that going back in will help. It will not help. We will either be there for another decade fighting these people off before we get weary again under a new president, and then things fall apart again and we just keep going back over and over and over again, while whoever they elect keeps being corrupt over and over again and not properly training their troops, or we will withdraw, it will fall into jihad, and there's nothing we can do about it. That is the point that we have reached, because we've mismanaged what we've done in this region so terribly. And it's no disrespect to the troops, they just did what they're told, but our politicians had no clue what they were doing. Bush didn't listen to his military advisors. Neither is Obama, and that's why this is a clusterfuck. It's a snafu, situation normal, all fucked up. And it's going to continue being like that. It's not going to get better just because we drop a few hundred men there, or drone a few thousand ISIS militants. They'll just recruit more people. They'll enslave people. They'll sodomize children and tell them to fight for Allah. They'll do what jihadists always tend to do, which is sickness and perversion and violence. And you can't weed them out because the one man who had the military backing necessary to keep them out of Iraq was Saddam Hussein, and we killed him and his family members. So we've effectively fucked the Iraqis from here to eternity. It's going to split up into multiple states most likely, and unfortunately at this point that scenario is probably the best outcome. Which means now we have several new states that we have to build ties with, or placate somehow, or pay off to keep from raising hell, or to keep from attacking their neighbors and trying to take more land, some conquest-happy, crazed jihadists in the middle of nowhere in a desert. We've fucked the situation up. How the hell are we going to make it better? With a massive influx of hundreds of thousands of troops backed by all these missiles and wonderful toys, we were not able to fix Iraq. In fact, we made it worse. We broke the toy. And now we can't fix it. And that's not going to change just because magically Obama's the president now and he's somehow better. It's going to be no better. It will be the same situation that it's been since 2003. So I completely oppose the idea of dropping these troops here because I know that they're likely to be used as a scapegoat for even more escalation later on. Bush did the same thing, by the way. A few attacks occur. Oh, we need a surge. Can anyone remember this fact, or do you not remember the Bush era? Are you so clouded by your own bias that you actually believe that Obama is functionally different from Bush? He's done the same thing. I had somebody yesterday come on with a list of 34 supposed Obama accomplishments. I found exactly 2 of them that you can actually, in an unbiased manner, consider accomplishments of any form. Most of them were actually policy failures. That's become Obama's legacy. It happened to Bush as well, because they have the same ideas. These same ideas have failed time and time again. They've been failing since the start of the Cold War. They do not work. It's time to re-examine how we operate in the third world, preferably not by going in and forcing regime change and getting people who are even worse than the ones we removed. It's time to do that and leave these people alone. It's fine to give aid to Maliki, to try to help him fight off the ISIS militants. That's fine. It's going to prolong the conflict, and he's probably going to lose in the long run anyway, because he's fighting guerrillas from the middle of the sand dunes. But it's acceptable to do that. Otherwise, we can just sit back and watch as something we tried to build falls apart. Like a Jenga tower. Bush kept removing pieces from it and building it taller and saying, look how much taller it is, it's so much better. And Obama just came along and swatted it right over by arming these militants, and then said, oh, well, now we need to build it back up, and started stacking the pieces exactly as they were before. It's still not going to be any more stable. A stiff breeze will blow it over. So we have failed in Iraq. We've failed in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is just waiting to collapse as soon as the last troops are out of there. The last few contingencies of men left that still are capable of fighting off these militants that keep arising every once in a while. It will fall. Syria, if we overthrow Assad, will eventually fall into the hands of jihadists as well. When we do this in a region which is hyper-religious, no good can come of it. And the reason we're doing it is because the Israelis would rather deal with militants than with these secular Russian-backed Shiite regimes. And the Saudis, they love it because they're just as butcherous and religious. They just happen to have a theocracy and a monarchy there, so they're able to keep a lid on people because they happen to control Mecca. And they can always threaten people and say, no Hajj for you. So we need to stay out of Iraq, stay out of Syria, get out of Afghanistan, and let these countries manage their own affairs. If they're not able to stand up after a decade of so-called nation building, they never will. And that's my final word on this whole situation. I don't want to see any more bullshit like this on the news. I want to see Obama resigns in disgrace because people finally wake up to how much similar he is to Bush and how big a failure he is. That's what I would like to see on the news. Instead, I'm likely to wake up tomorrow and see a dozen Americans get killed trying to airlift civilians out. Obama calls for surge of 50,000 reserves into Iraq to fight ISIS. And then the next day I'll wake up and say, ISIS defeated, flees to Syria. Obama requests more troops and air support to topple Assad and do away with jihad forever. Lord Obama will fix it all somehow. Where Bush failed, Obama somehow will magically appear and make it better. Like Bush was a stinging nettle and Obama's a bottle of vinegar. It's not going to work.